The question is now that the amendment be agreed to. I call the member for Bowman.
Deputy Speaker, I'm delighted to support the repeal of this bill and, of course, the end of the work of ARENA. And the previous Speaker putting forward the opposition's position, I guess, falls for that sequential failure that Labor thinks that the more authorities they can create, the better the world will be. And I guess we tend to forget that this is not really about how many bureaucrats we can employ in an authority to be doing the job that the department should be doing. This is genuinely about what Australia is doing to contribute towards more cost-effective and more availability of renewable energy. I mean, that's what it's all about. And for those that are watching in the gallery, what they're witnessing, of course, is an opposition utterly focused on inputs. How big is the authority? How many water bubblers, cubicles and lumber supports there are, and how much money is being spent. And you've got a government over this side utterly focused on outcomes. And that is exactly what we owe the Australian people. In the end, what we want are successful and well-managed projects, and many of those were being managed very well by ARENA. But the test is not whether or not we like ARENA or we like the acronym or how many authorities we managed to set up back when we were in government. The true test of all this is what is the most effective way to bring on new technology. And I would argue you don't need just another authority to do it. And at some point, we just had to stop the party. And the current government appreciated that what we've inherited is an economic mess where a former Labor government had no idea where the money was coming from and they'd already given the money away. I mean, that's what has been inherited. Not an easy position to take over. But of course, we're used to it because we did the same thing in 1996 and we are up to the task. Now, in my state of Queensland, there's some wonderful renewable energy projects. I want to devote a little bit of time to those. And those continue to be managed. They continue to be supported. But let's not forget that we are part of a global renewable energy push. And while there might be a unified public good in progressing with renewable energy, Australia is just a very, very small but significant part of it. In the end, what we have to make sure is that we're looking after our national interest and that the projects we are doing are utterly relevant to Australia. And many that were being managed by ARENA were. But I thought that the previous Speaker, who represents the view of the Labor Party in all these matters, made a very interesting comment when he said that this government had provided no evidence that the role of ARENA could be better done and better performed by the department. Do you notice that subtle switch? This is a former Labor government that created authorities like mushrooms and then insists upon us that we have to prove that the department is better at doing it. I mean, let's just come back a couple of steps. Isn't that the job of a department, to carry out the instructions of the government of the day in a strong, fearless and independent manner? Back in the old days, departments used to do that, remember? But no, not anymore. No, we still have growing and overgrown departments, and then we created authorities over and above. And did you hear the Labor Speaker saying what was so good about ARENA was that unlike the department, they were strong and fearless and independent? I mean, weren't they the three adjectives that public servants across this nation raised their hands and swore to when they joined? To be strong, fearless, independent, advice to the government of the day, but suddenly Labor's reinvented all this and only authorities can do that. These are separate agencies because the department couldn't do it. And if you keep taking that direction, then you simply end up with 23, 24, 25% of this great nation's GDP just being consumed in bureaucrats and public servants who are working in authorities rather than a department. I mean, it becomes preposterous. And at some point, when you're leaking hundreds of billions of dollars in deficits every year and a surplus or balanced budget is nowhere in sight, you just have to pull on the handbrake. You just have to slow things down and revisit. And at this point, there is $1 billion of excellent projects that are currently being managed and will continue to be managed. But this Labor Party patronising view that the department's not good enough to do it. Now, the department's not up to it because we need someone truly fearless and independent. I mean, what are we left with? And where do we go if we have this view that these large federal departments that neither treat a patient nor educate a child need to remain with thousands of employees, and then we're going to set up even more authorities on the side? And look, I never saw a Labor minister who didn't dream of setting up an authority. I mean, I never saw a Labor minister who didn't know how to spend a dollar, but I never saw a Labor minister who knew where the dollar was coming from. That's right, we just racked up the debt because it was in the national interest. And what's fascinating is that when you go into debt, and then suddenly economies are on the move and interest rates start to rise, what the Labor Party forgot was that we actually have to pay that interest back in 70% of cases to foreign interests. I mean, that's where we borrowed the money from. We borrowed the money for all of this dream from the Middle East and from China. I mean, they're the people we're now paying back. Their sovereign wealth funds, their superannuation funds. You know, that's where Australia's hard-earned taxpayer dollars are going. All the way from the seat of Solomon, all the way down to the wonderful state of Tasmania. The $1 billion a month that we pay because of Labor excesses and their dreams that were unfunded, that's $1 billion that I can't spend on that young child who needs laser treatment for their retinopathy of prematurity. That's $1 billion a month that I cannot spend in fine schools or early intervention for the children that need it, that come from vulnerable families. These people who live in remote and Indigenous Australia must remain right at the centre of our focus and never lose sight of the $1 billion that is never spent on these fine Australians because of Labor's decision instead to pay interest on debt. To pay interest on debt. Now, we're not talking about this sort of momentary GFC, global financial collapse where everyone had to engage in some fiscal stimulus and obviously some increasing liquidity. But what we're talking about is that long after the GFC had passed, long after economies all around the world had realised that this was going to be a couple of years and not a decade of recession, what we saw was, as the evidence came in that Australia was not going to have a single quarter of recession, Deputy Speaker, we still had the pedal to the metal, spending money as fast as they could, writing cheques for foreigners and for dead people, and transferring money as quickly as they could that was mostly spent on flat screens and imports that, to help South Korea avoid a recession, it did nothing to help Australia. I mean, this massive cash transfers that were utterly unfunded, Labor had no idea where the money was coming from, is emblematic of their attitude here, which is that we just set up another authority to do the job that we don't want to do, that we can't trust the department to do. Well, let's wind it all back. These are brilliant projects. They don't require much more than sophisticated assessment to make sure that they're good value for money, and then careful contract management. We don't need a high-rise building full of publicly funded officials to do much more. These things are running with the private sector putting a dollar in, putting their shoulder to the wheel and knowing exactly what they're trying to do. Let's go up to Doomadgee, where they're assessing the technical viability and the systematic reliability of a hybrid energy system. It's only small, it's 1.2 megawatt, but it actually bolts on. The PV generation bolts onto their diesel that runs the community. What a great idea. We don't need a high-rise of people micromanaging that project. It was assessed. It cleared the bar. This is basic business of the public service 101. Not for ARENA. And I recognise good people like Greg Bourne who devoted the last 2 years to seeing ARENA doing great work, but that time has closed. The money has been dispersed, the projects are up and running, and now let them just go without the added interference of a freestanding authority. The Collinsville Power Station, currently 180 megawatts of power, they're completely reconfiguring it up there to a 30 megawatt but hybrid solar thermal gas power station. Very, very important work and assessed as being worthy, demonstrating benefits. We don't need an authority to manage all of that. This is just old Labor thinking, and too often jobs given to Labor mates, I have to add, to run these authorities at hopelessly over-bloated public salaries. And I'd like to actually know what some of the salaries are that are paid in these authorities. Of course, algal fuels, of great excitement around the world. The US Navy now committing to running some of their own vessels purely on algal fuels. This sort of microalgal biomass, very exciting. It's actually consuming the CO2 that we've got nowhere to put. It's creating, as a waste product, algal fuel and then a non-nitrous fertiliser in a global scene where we're short on phosphate fertiliser. This is producing nitrate fertiliser that can be used in our farming sector. Exciting stuff. Again, you don't need to have an authority to manage stuff, and historically this was all done elegantly by department. The Kogan Creek Solar Boost project is also, in a much larger sense, a 44 megawatt addition of renewable energy to a 750 megawatt coal-fired power station. That'll be the largest of its kind in the world. Well worth funding, still being funding, please don't panic. We can take away an authority but still have the money invested where it counts, on the front line with the smartest people working on the breakthroughs that ensure we have more renewable energy. Redeployable hybrid power, a uniquely Australian solution. If we're going to go out and have remote projects consuming large amounts of energy for things like drilling and prospecting, why not have a fully put up, pull down, pack down, whatever the acronym is, to lower costs, to be able to provide power in these camps that then can move on to a different site. This reduces the need for expensive trucked-in diesel. You know, a great idea. To be honest, when it comes to contract management after you've approved, it's not that complex a job. Redeployable hybrid power is also promising. So this is a portable hybrid solar diesel plant, a very exciting work. And then, of course, working on reflective coatings to make solar panels more efficient. I mean, that's something we're doing for the whole world. That's something we're leading with mineral technology to make sure that solar panels are as efficient as they can be, particularly, I think, in the household situation where they're popped on a roof and then rarely maintained. In Weipa, not far away from Doomadgee, we have the situation where there's enormously energy-hungry activity up there in the bauxite operation run by Rio Tinto. So there they already have a solar farm and they're operating, you know, 6.7 megawatt solar farm, which is already added on to what's effectively called a solar village operating under a power purchase agreement. So these are remote parts of the world where a significant amount of the expense is due to the provision of power. Now, the Speaker for the Opposition immediately prior to me did refer to Labor's views about the RET and where things are heading. And obviously, we're looking forward to seeing announcements from the government's review, which are due very soon. But to mistake the fact that renewable energies offer us a cheaper alternative with the fact that the RET expanding from 20% compels energy users to pay relatively high marginal amounts for power is the truth behind elevated short to medium term power prices. But yes, the long term, there is the potential to bring them down over the long term. But we're also forgetting over the long term it will be cheaper, but in the short term it isn't. And the problem with that is that we're actually seeing a reduction in consumption of power in Australia anyway. I mean, partly because of changed domestic practices, but mostly because, like most wealthy economies, we're basically expropriating a lot of our highly energy-intensive activity to China. And so we're closing our smelters, and that's having an enormous effect and leading to an oversupply of power in this country. So any modelling that assumes that, you know, conventional power providers are simply going to keep churning that power out is hopelessly erroneous. They're going to respond to the market. And so my view here is that we can get a sensible middle ground, that we will have a renewable target and a very, very important role for renewables. I'm sure that will continue. There's an enormous number of those on us on this side who are going to fight to make sure that it does, and we won't be villainised by the other side. Look, in conclusion, I think what we saw from the previous Speaker on the Labor Party, despite his relatively short but glorious career as a minister in this portfolio, look, his halcyon recollections of running around with his business card in the few weeks that he had in the portfolio probably isn't the best example of where we are heading. In reality, we can lead the world still in many of these areas, but we do not have to have authorities, replete with authorities. It is only appropriate that we achieve the outcomes, that we invest the money on the front line. It's consistent with the Coalition's approach. I mean, ultimately, you can only have so many non-service providing public servants in the system before it becomes unwieldy, it becomes expensive, and it actually bogs down. I'm delighted to see that ARENA is being repealed. The projects will go on. They will continue to be managed, and that's the kind of nation that Australians are looking for.
Thank the member for Bowman.